Okay, so here we are at the last section, section 8 of McCloskey's 1983 article. The section's entitled The Good of Rhetoric. So here is where McCloskey is saying, well, in answering the question, well, so what? Okay, so let's say we give up the modernist ideals of a pure objective science which achieves certainty, at least in the long run. Give that up in exchange for this notion of rhetoric, this kind of disciplined conversation which doesn't achieve certainty. You only can argue your case for a plausible conclusion or a reasonable conclusion, or a fair method of investigation and so on, that doesn't really, nail down once and for all the great truths. Well, okay, let's say we accept all that. Well, so what? What's the benefits of doing that? Here McCloskey answers that question. So she's got a list. 1, it would lead to better writing. Economics is poorly written. It is often formulaic, not written with clarity or honesty foremost in mind. So I think we can... all non-economists who crack open an economics journal on any given page and start reading will agree with at least the first part. Economics is poorly written. It's not written to communicate clearly to any given educated reader. It's not even written clearly to communicate as effectively as possible to other economists. In fact, we might even go one step further. It's not even written clearly in order to communicate in an effective way with specialists in the particular subfield which that article is writing on. Often there will be an effort to complicate the writing style or to make it turgid or difficult to understand, partly because there's a bit of, if you like, egomaniacal showing off there. You've got to, if you can present your work as difficult to understand, then that indicates your intelligence in some way to the reader. That sometimes might be what's going on in those cases. Alternatively, it could simply be the case that economists don't practice writing well and aren't concerned about trying to communicate effectively. They're trying to pump out an article and get it done and whack it on the CV and so on, and they're not really concerned about whether anyone is convinced by it or not. Of course, you want everyone to cite it, but you don't care if anyone believes it. That's beside the point. So the questions of style or questions of communicative skill and the attempt to persuade might simply not be on the agenda sometimes. So if McCloskey's saying here we should be paying attention to the rhetoric, in effect she's kind of implicitly saying sometimes economists need to change their whole their entire way of thinking about what they're doing. That is, change their goals. You should be seeking to persuade others of the truth of what you're saying, rather than just, trying to show off or trying to just get something published. Better teaching is another outcome. McCloskey says economists teach poorly because they often don't recognise the tacitness of economic knowledge and therefore teach by axiom and proof instead of by problem solving and practice. This might in some way just as a side note, reflects something of McCloskey's own training as an economist and her own teaching experience as an economist. It's certainly the case that at Chicago there was, I don't know what it's like now, but there was, especially with Milton Friedman, I think, a style of teaching which really was focused on problem solving. So you'd come to class and there'd be a problem to solve, and everyone would have to beaver away trying to come up with something and then present their answers to Friedman, who would then, almost inevitably argue with the student, rather than a kind of a rote approach where you learn the axioms, you learn a set of axioms by memory, you learn how to express them in symbolic form, you learn how to deduce theorems from that and prove those theorems, and then you're done. It's then assumed now you know this theory. McCloskey's saying that's not how most people think, and also it doesn't get to the nub of the issue. It doesn't get to what really the axioms and the theory, or the axioms and the theorem, were really about. A good example would be if you go to, for example, if you go to an A-star economics journal and try and search for something like the Coase theorem, find a modern article about that, and then compare that to Ronald Coase's own first exposition of what's now come to be called the Coase theorem, and look at the different styles of writing and the different styles of, in a sense, teaching. Because what Ronald Coase was doing in his article was, in a sense, trying to teach the educated reader a new way of thinking about the problem of externalities. And he's doing it, he does it by way of concrete, or they're imaginary examples, but they're very down-to-earth, practical kinds of examples which you can imagine yourself. So it's almost like little stories, where you can imagine yourself in the story, and he then goes through how your thinking processes might operate in that situation. It's a very instructive way of learning about what we now call the Coase theorem. Coase himself, incidentally, didn't think it was a theorem at all. But nonetheless, compare that then to a journal article or an advanced microeconomics textbook, and you'll see that it's much harder to understand what the Coase theorem is really about in its modern exposition. It's much easier to see what's happening by going back to the original, to Ronald Coase himself, who never expressed anything mathematically. It was just in terms of prose, and well-written prose at that. You learn more from that than from the axiomatic form in an advanced micro textbook. Better foreign relations. So this is foreign relations here, is not talking about international relations. It's talking about relations with other academic disciplines. The relationship between economics and, say, political science and sociology, for example. And the reason McCloskey is mentioning this is because in the 1970s and 1980s, there was a kind of a push by some economists to start looking at phenomena that were not generally regarded as the areas that economists would traditionally be involved in. But nonetheless, economists started applying standard or orthodox economic theory or economic concepts to these other areas. So you had economists moving into the areas of politics or political science and reconstructing how they saw the behaviour of politicians and the behaviour of coalitions, political parties, thinking about what would be the ideal or most efficient, most welfare-enhancing constitution, for example. And you had, say, for example, you had other economists who were starting to think about, as I've mentioned in a previous video, people like Gary Becker saying, well, why don't we treat the rational consumer in the supermarket as someone who goes home and continues to be a rational agent in deciding how many dates to go on, whether to get married, how many kids to have, whether to get divorced, and who should do the housework, and all of those sorts of questions. So think about answering those questions using standard orthodox, in this case neoclassical economic theory to conceptualize these decisions. So you get economics moving into these other areas. So this is kind of foreign relations. And McCloskey points out that economics is poorly understood and disliked by humanists on the one hand and scientists on the other. She says the flabby methodology of modernist economics simply makes this colonization of other disciplines more difficult. So she's not opposed to this, what came to be called economic imperialism, or colonization of other disciplines by economics. She wasn't opposed to that, but she's saying that it's a really difficult job when you come with this ridiculously unrealistic and out-of-date modernist methodology that no one else takes seriously anymore. More difficult, raising irrelevant methodological doubts in the minds of the colonized folk. So you lose legitimacy as a colonizer of other disciplines when you come with this antique relic from the philosophy of science, this so-called objective scientific method, all in capital letters, which obtains the truth in capital letters, which no one takes seriously anymore. This is McCloskey's claim anyway, or in my words, it's McCloskey's claim. So she says, if you take on rhetoric, then you're throwing out that ridiculous cartoonish account of the scientific method and replacing it with something more realistic, something that is identifiable by people in other disciplines as well, because other disciplines are using a rhetoric that McCloskey is advocating somewhat more self-consciously, often. Not necessarily in all disciplines. In psychology, I think McCloskey would agree, in psychology has something like the same problem that is being identified here. It holds to this cartoonish fantasy version of an official scientific method which obtains the truth. I think McCloskey would say, yeah, in psychology this is ridiculous as well. But in other disciplines, that's not true. In other disciplines, there's a more rhetorical style. Right? It admits subjectivity. It admits value judgments. It admits that all arguments and conclusions are fallible, that they're revisable, that there's always a degree of uncertainty, and one can be creative in one's combination of different concepts, theoretical concepts, to come up with new ideas, and that's perfectly fine. You can do empirical work, of course, but it doesn't guarantee that what you're theory suggests is necessarily true. It's an ongoing conversation, so to speak. So in sociology, in areas of political science, even in some of the business disciplines, such as in management and some areas of marketing, even in some areas of accounting, believe it or not, that view of rhetoric is quite acceptable. So if economists come along with a similar kind of an approach, then it's easier to colonize those other disciplines. Better science. Taking on this view of rhetoric leads to better science. Economists, McCloskey says, pointlessly limit themselves to so-called objective facts. There is a wide range of sources of legitimate evidence available that is unexplored because of the blinkers that economists put on themselves by telling themselves a story about how they should be objective. So, for example, she gives the example of survey research and introspection as a side note. So, in the case of survey research, you remember from reading Milton Friedman's 1953 article, The Methodology of Positive Economics. Friedman has a whole section there where he kicks the living daylights out of survey research, arguing that it doesn't really demonstrate anything worthwhile. It doesn't justify any conclusions that one might come to. So it's not a satisfactory means of testing. Unfortunately, I think from McCloskey's perspective anyway, unfortunately this idea really took hold in the discipline of economics. So for decades, economists, as a general rule, have not utilized surveys of real flesh and blood human beings in order to attempt to discover things about the world. Many other disciplines do it. Many of the disciplines dealing with human beings, of course, do this in psychology, in marketing, in management. This is industrial relations. This is common practice to ask people why they do what they do. Why did they make this choice rather than that choice? And so on and so forth. But not in economics. McCloskey says this is it's ridiculous. There's no need to restrict ourselves in that way. It's okay. We can use survey research as much as any other kind of research. This is a genuine source of evidence. It doesn't mean it's the only thing you should ever do. It's another, string to the bow, so to speak, that strengthens the body of evidence that's used to try and establish whether a particular idea or a particular hypothesis or theory is correct. For those who would say, well, no, this is no survey material, survey stuff is no good because you're just asking people about their subjective views. And what we really should be doing, as Friedman argued, is forget about what people think or what people say they think they're doing. Look at what they actually do. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. That is, it's in the seeing what people choose. No, don't ask. If you ask someone, do you prefer Mars bars to Snickers, and they say, oh, I like Snickers the most, and you say, okay, good. Now we know about their preferences. I like Snickers twice as much as I like Mars bars. We say, oh, good. Now we know all about their preferences, right? One Snickers equals two Mars bars. Fine. Well, Friedman and everyone since would say that's totally irrelevant. Look at what they choose to buy. That will tell you about what they prefer. Okay? Now, because that's objective, right? That's objective observation of the real world. And McCloskey says, well, you can't say that objective observation of behaviour really is superior to the subjective meanings that one gets out of surveys if one is observing the wrong things. It's all very well and good to say, oh yes, well I've objectively observed this, and that's what, and you know, therefore my work is better than others. If you're observing things that don't matter, right, and then personally attaching significance to it, that's irrelevant. You're not doing something worthwhile in that case. Okay? Or alternatively, objective observation isn't necessarily superior if what you are observing, the behaviour you're observing, you are systematically misinterpreting the meaning of. Okay? So if someone, you know, you say, okay, they chose the Mars bars over the Snickers. We observe them choose that. Have we understood why they've done that? What's the meaning of this decision? Did they do it because they're being blackmailed into it? Did they do it because they like the taste of Mars bars? Did they do it simply out of sheer unconscious habit? Did they buy the Mars bars for someone else? The purchase of the Mars bars doesn't tell you much about the choice that someone made, that is, the decision making that occurred. And if economics is meant to be about the decision making of agents, then by just observing the behaviour, you're leaving out the very thing that's supposed to be defining the discipline. Well, at least one interpretation of defining the discipline. Better dispositions. Scientific debates in economics are long-lasting and ill-tempered. Well, that's certainly true. There's lots of very amusing examples of economists dissing each other over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st century. But it's naive to think that the disagreement, the debates in economics, is due solely to political or personal bias or mendacity and self-interestedness on the part of the people who are in disagreement. So from the perspective of modernism, if you would say something like, look, everyone should follow the scientific method, and by following the scientific method, we will eventually discover the truth. Right? And since the truth can never disagree with itself, there is only one truth, and once we've discovered that, everyone should align with that. Everyone should agree with that. There should be no disagreements. If there are disagreements, it means that the person who disagrees with, quote-unquote, the truth is doing so for political reasons, or they're doing it because of a personal bias, a psychological, cognitive bias on their part, which and prevents them from seeing the truth, or because they're behaving in a mendacious way. They recognise that it's the truth, but they don't want to admit it for some reason or other, maybe for some self-interested reason. That's the way that modernism would have to try and understand disagreements that occur in a discipline which calls itself scientific. But McCloskey says once we move to seeing economics as disciplined conversation, right, as rhetoric, we've thrown out the cartoon version of the scientific method, then we come to realise that facts and logic never ensure complete certainty. We can never be certain we've achieved the truth, or any given person has achieved the truth. And it means that the conclusions that any given economist or scientist comes to is always, at the end of the debate, going to have a degree of uncertainty in it. Right? it's always possible to debate whether this conclusion is really true. So it's in the very nature of the uncertainty and the fallibility of science, and in particular economic science, that there is going to be debate, okay? That there is going to be disagreement. Also, and it's not because there's any political agenda or because of personal bias or because of mendacity. It's in the nature of it's the epistemic nature of it that there's probably going to be debates that are going to arise because you can never be certain about what the truth of the matter is. Okay. Also, honest and unbiased people can legitimately disagree over values that inform their fallible beliefs. Okay? So people will often have different sets of values at work, and that affects the worth that they attribute to a certain conclusion that's been drawn, or the importance of a particular conclusion that's been drawn, or the significance of a particular conclusion. That might be affected by their values. It's not just by what the conclusion is in straight up factual terms. Okay? It's an evaluation of that conclusion. Okay? So people will have different values, and that's fine, right? And they can be entirely honest about that, and you're going to get disagreements arising. McCloskey's general point here is that once we've moved to this conception of economics as a form of rhetoric, or economic methodology as a form of as rhetoric, then we'll recognize the nature of these debates, why debates occur, why disagreements are occurring. Right? And once we do that they're not for terrible reasons. It's not because of dark political biases or personal defects in people's thinking, or their self-interestedness. It's not necessarily about that, right, at all. And for that reason, disagreements will continue, but they can continue in a more friendly and collegial manner, because there won't be that suspicion about why doesn't X agree with me. Okay. Finally, the last little bit I'll say, I'll just have a quote here from the last section of this part of the essay. McCloskey says, a rhetorical cure for such disabilities, so that's the disabilities all listed above, a rhetorical cure for such disabilities would reject at least a philosophy that pretended to legislate the knowable. So this is going back to this positivist, or what she's calling modernist philosophy of science. Right? You would reject that. The cure would merely recognize the good health of economics, disguised under the neurotic inhibitions of an artificial methodology of science. So here she's, at the end of the day, she's saying, look, there's nothing really wrong with economics per se as it stands. The problem is not with economics or the practice of economics in itself. The problem is how that practice is conceptualized. And that practice is being conceptualized by this artificial methodology of science that's coming from outside, that's being imposed by philosophers of science and by economic methodologists who seek to preside over and police the discipline and convince everyone you should be doing science according to these methodological rules and regulations, otherwise you're not true scientists. So McCloskey's saying that's where the problem lies. It's lying with this neurosis about thinking about economic thinking. Right? The economic thinking in and of itself is fine. It's the thinking about the thinking which is neurotic and that needs to change. Okay, so that's pretty much that for McCloskey's essay.